Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. First of all, let me express my deep gratitude for organizers and participants here. I'm extremely lucky to have been provided an opportunity previously to interact with the first batch of Thanshia. And again, I'm lucky to get this opportunity to attend this inaugural session for the third batch of Thanshia. I congratulate all of you for being selected for this wonderful course. A great mission, a great cause, inshallah. So, dear brothers, my talk will be divided into three parts or sub themes. First, I'll try to discuss a little bit about what is Islamic intellectual tradition and how it is developed, how it is based, how it is built. Secondly, I will talk a little bit on what it means to approach the contemporary in terms of or in context of intellectual tradition, and why this approaching the contemporary requires us to revisit the intellectual classical Islamic tradition. And finally, the third, I'll deal with the issue of how scholars, contemporary scholars, they're approaching to revisit the classical Islamic tradition and approaching the contemporary. So I'll try to make it brief and concise. So first of all, what Islamic tradition means? What is Islamic tradition? If you don't mind, how many of you have? I mean, the students. How many of you have background of Islamic studies? Any formal background of Islamic studies among the participants or the students of Thanshia? Many. All right. So it means I don't have to start from the scratch. You guys are already have the strong background of Islamic studies. So let me come forward. So what Islamic tradition means? If we look at Islamic tradition, it's not something very monolithic, very singular, very agreed upon and consensual. It's if we define the Islamic tradition, we might say it's collective discursive efforts of scholars throughout the Islamic history, spanning over the millennium and more, to understand Islam in their own realities. So if we take this loose definition of Islamic tradition, so we may say that there are 2 or 3 major features of Islamic tradition. First of them, it's about the extreme diversity in Islamic tradition. It's not about monolithic single idea. When we say Islamic tradition, it's not like one very well defined, agreed upon, very clear idea what Islamic tradition is. It's extreme diversity. It's expression of about extreme diversity. So, for example, let me give you some examples. When it comes to the fiqh is kind of core of the Islamic tradition. It deals with our life, with our realities, with our daily issues, how to be a Muslim, and what to do to be a Muslim, how to face the challenges, the realities, the problems, that issues in our life, being a Muslim. So when it comes to the fiqh, for example, we may see that from the very beginning, from the origin and from the emergence and development of Islamic fiqh, there have been very diverse schools of thought in Islamic fiqh. So, for example, in the very beginning, we had 2 major schools. We had Madrasatul Ra'i, we call it, and we had Madrasatul Asar or Madrasatul Hadith, for example. The schools based on reasoning, for example, and the school based on narrations or ahadith, for example. Then came up the third school in that sequence, which tried to synthesize the both schools. So this was the origin. And then we can see there were more than 8 established big school of thoughts in Islamic fiqh, starting from Maliki and Hanafi and Shafi and Hanbali and Ibadi and Jafari and so on. So this is the situation in the fiqh, for example. If we look at the usul al-fiqh, which deals with more about the fundamentals of Islam and how to understand the Sharia, how to approach the text of the Islam, for example, how to evaluate the dalalat, the understanding of the Sharia. So there again we can see there were in the beginning, in the development, at the time of development of the usul al-fiqh, the fundamentals of Islamic jurisprudence, there were 2 major schools of thought. One was called Tariqatul Ahnaf. The other one was called Tariqatul Mutakallimin, for example, or Tariqatul Shafi'iyya. and later on developed another school of thought in that sequence, which was termed as Tariqa Haditha, for example. And then so many other schools of thought. These are, I'm just giving examples of the major schools of thoughts which are depicting and denoting the diversity of Islamic tradition. Similarly, if you talk about the Kalam, for example, theology, which are more about understanding the fundamentals of Islam, the philosophy of Islam, the creed of Islam, the answers of the fundamental existential philosophical questions about the life. So there again you may realize the diversity, extreme diversity in the Islamic tradition. So starting from Ashaira, Maturidiya, Mu'tazila, and then so many others. So the first feature of Islamic tradition is the diversity, extreme diversity. The second feature of Islamic tradition is, you might call it, the evolution, the development, and most importantly, the evolution in understanding the position. What I mean is, for example, we may see in Islamic tradition there are tendencies of claiming about the dominant position, which is called Jamhur, Sawad-e-Azam, for example, Ijma. This kind of notions are very available very much in Islamic tradition. So everyone tries to claim the dominance, the majority of the opinion, the prominence about his position, his view regarding any particular question. This kind of views, this kind of claims, this kind of assumptions are very conflicting. So, for example, I'll give you just one example. There is a masala, a issue called a ta'lil. Ta'lil means try to get the wisdom, the reason, the cause behind the revelation, right? So in details and in general, it's called ta'lil. The question was, is it right and is it allowed to go for ta'lil in what Allah has given us, what Allah has sent to us in terms of the teachings, in terms of the rulings? So there were two positions, two broadly positions in that question. One said about the permission. We can go for exploring the question of why Allah is asking us this, why Sharia is asking us this. And the other position was not allowing. It's prohibited, it's not allowed to ask the question why in Sharia. When we look at the writings of the classical scholars, we find that people, exponents of each position, each view, they claim that they are the dominant and they are the majority and they are the ijma. So this position of ijma was always very important in our tradition. Who is claiming ijma and how strongly he is claiming ijma for his position, for his view. But if we look at the tradition, we find that the notion of ijma and the notion of jamhur and the notion of majority, the notion of dominance, also shifts and moves from one to another. I'll give you just one example. There is a verse in Quran, Surah Yusuf, وَهَمَّتْ بِهِ وَهَمَّ بِهَا لَوْلَا أَرَّى بُرْهَانَ رَبِّي. In the story of the Yusuf, right? وَلَقَدْ هَمَّتْ بِهِ وَهَمَّ بِهَا لَوْلَا أَرَّى بُرْهَانَ رَبِّي. There was a dominant position in the understanding or interpretation of that verse. And the classical mufassirin, interpreters of the Quran, they claim that this is the right position and this is the agreed upon position and this is the majority and dominant position. And anyone who deviates from this interpretation of this verse is going astray, is deviant, is al-zalal, wrong path. Later on, after a few centuries, starting from Ibn al-Jawzi and then going through many scholars until Ibn Taymiyyah, the position extremely shifted to the opposite. And then the dominant view became the one which was earlier deviant view. And this is just one example. So to brief it again, to conclude it, the first part, Islamic tradition actually is all about diversity. And it's all about, again, one thing, in addition to the claiming of the dominance and the majority, there was also a tendency in our tradition which is in more modern context, more modern terms, it's called labeling. So many of you who are coming from social science background, they might be aware of labeling theory. So Quran also calls this tanabuz bil alqab, right? So everyone, or many of the scholars in our tradition, they had the tendency to label the others, to denounce their work, to denounce their position, to denounce their view. For example, Imam Shashi was one of the most prominent scholars of Usul al-Fiqh in Shafi school of thought. But he, even by many Shafi scholars, he was called deviant, and he was called the one who is going astray from the right position. Or you might be aware of the labeling that was pushed for Ibn Hazm, for example, Ibn Taymiyyah, for example, even Abu Hanifa, for example, Al-Farabi, for example, Ibn Sina, for example, Ibn Rushd, for example. So labeling was also there in our tradition. In brief, in conclusion, what I mean, I'm trying to point out is the complexity of our tradition. Our tradition is quite complex things. To deal with the tradition requires us to understand the tradition, to essence of the tradition, to core of the tradition, and the diversity of the tradition. Let me come to the second point. Why this? What made this tradition? How this tradition was built? So, to make it very precise, our tradition is actually composed of two major elements. Our tradition, Islamic classical tradition. So these features are actually part and reason and result of the way the tradition was formed and the way the tradition was developed. Tradition is actually composed of two major elements. The first thing is understanding of the text of the tradition or the revelation, which is what Quran and Sunnah. So the first major element, component of our tradition is understanding of the text. And when it comes to the understanding of the text, there again, it's a very complex phenomena. When we say the text, it includes the Quran and Sunnah. When we talk, for example, about the Quran, so we have a very lengthy, complex discussion about the way Quran can be interpreted, the way Quran can be understood. So, for example, people are in agreement that Quran is authentic in its text, in its content. There is no doubt that this part is part of the Quran, starting from Suratul Fatiha, ending with Suratul Nas. This is the Quran. There is no doubt about that. But when it comes to understanding the Quran or interpretation of the Quran, so many scholars or most of the scholars, they opine or they say that Quran in its meaning is Zanniyud Dalala, meaning may carry more than one meaning, for example. And this will lead to the diversity of understanding, diversity of getting the meaning of the Quran. So this is when it comes to the Quran. When it comes to the Sunnah, for example, so the range is very wide to get the diversity in understanding of the text of the Sunnah. Firstly, when it comes to the authenticity of the Sunnah, whether this is Sunnah really or not, there will always be different of the position or difference of the opinions among scholars and muhaddithin, for example. Even when it comes to the chain through which one established the authenticity of hadith, there are always a scope for diversity and disagreement. And most importantly, when it comes to understanding of the text of the Sunnah, there the possibility of diversity is very large. And the reason is, most of the text of the Sunnah reach to us in a way which is not in a very systematic way, in a very inclusive way, which does not include the context in which they were said, for example, they were spoken, they were acted, for example. So the role of context in understanding of the Sunnah is missing from what has reached to us from the Sunnah. And that has led to the diversity and conflicting understanding of the Sunnah. So this is one element of tradition, which is about understanding of the text. The second thing is understanding of the context, the realities. And when we know, when we talk about the realities, when we talk about the context, when we talk about the society, so societies, the realities have always been complex. Human beings are actually complex. So the society that they form collectively will always be complex. So the understanding of the context will always differ in its content, in its position, in its view. Because of two possibility of conflicting views and disagreement in understanding the components of the Islamic tradition, this was the situation with the tradition. Now let me come to the contemporary. What means the contemporary? If we have even little bit know-how about what and how history has changed, how society has changed, leave the question of in what direction it's changing, leave the question of whether the changes are positive or negative, whether the changes are appreciable or condemnable, for example. The important thing is to what extent the life has changed, to what extent the world has changed. And here I think, I guess, when you'll go in your course through the discussion on modernity and modern epoch, you will realize how drastic and fundamental the changes have taken place in human life. I can't speak a lot about the changes and the implications that they brought in human life. Let me give just one or two examples to get the meaning of how different we are in, how different our context is. So, for example, the notion of citizenship, right? The notion of citizenship and also the notion of state, for example. You might take the both, which are quite interconnected with each other. And the impact that they put in our life, in every aspect of the life, in our political life, in our economic life, in our educational life, in our social life, in our family life, whatever aspect of life you may imagine, the role and the impact these concepts and these changes have made in our life, the state and citizenship. Because you must be aware that this notion of state with territorial boundaries and this notion of citizenship bound with the country, with the boundaries and with the constitution and with the nation is something unprecedented in human history. It was never there in this form, in this sense, in pre-modern societies throughout this human history. So, regardless of how acceptable or how positive these changes are, I mean the development of state and the development of citizenship, the notion of citizenship, but the way they are impacting our life and the way they are influencing our life from micro level to macro level, this is radical, this is fundamental and drastic. So when we reach to the modern time, the modern world, which was very different, not only in one or two respects, almost in the every aspect of the life, the meaning of life changed, the meaning of the relationship changed, the meaning of work changed, the meaning of livelihood changed, the meaning of travel changed, the meaning of accommodation changed, the meaning of migration changed. So things changed fundamentally. When this situation came, which we call contemporary, which is in the making and in the process of changing. So when the Muslims, we went through this changing time, there happened three important things which required us as Muslims and required our scholars, Muslim scholars, to revisit Islamic tradition and to approach the contemporary in a bit different way or in extremely different way. So those three things were what? First thing was there were many issues, many questions, many problems which were completely new, unprecedented for Muslims. They had to get the answer for those changes, those questions, those problems. And because those problems were radically different from what they have been accustomed of throughout their life, throughout their history, So the answer, to get the answer from their tradition was quite challenging, quite difficult. And we know very well that before modernity or in the wake of modernity, prior to modernity, around 500 years or 400 years, Islamic tradition became through a very stagnant, rigid process. So, for example, after the generation of Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Khaldun, Ash-Shatibi, we don't really hear any big name, any big scholar until the modern period started. Ibn Ashur and then Muhammad Abdu and Rashid Rada. So, quite a long period we went through in a very stagnant, rigid position. So, when these new questions arose, Muslims were unable to get the answer for those questions. So, this was the one aspect of modern life. The second aspect was when Muslim, they upheld their tradition, they talked about their tradition, and they tried to adhere to their tradition in the changing scenario, in what constituted the modern life, the modern society, the modern stage, the modern platforms. At many instances, they were not able to defend their position. So the first instance, the questions were new and they were not able to reach to their questions. In the second instance, the second point, the questions were quite earlier, quite old, classical, but the answers that they had for those questions they were not able to stand for those answers. They were not able to hold those answers. For example, I'll give just one example or two example. The whole question about the differentiation of the world on the basis of religion and what it impacts in the rights of the people. So the way in our classical tradition we had divided the world into two parts, Darul Islam and Darul Kufr, Darul Harb, and the way we had assigned the rights and the obligation on the basis of this definition, that was quite difficult to hold in this changed, completely radical, different world. The second example might be the question of apostasy, for example, right? Ridda, if a Muslim changes his religion, he converts from Islam to some other religion. So in classical tradition, we had the position that the apostate must be killed, right? But a time when people are talking about the fundamental rights, basic rights, human rights, and like all others, we are also demanding our rights. We are also demanding our rights to be Muslim and also to make others, to convince others and to make them our fellow religions, our brothers, Muslims. So, in that kind of scenario, in that kind of context, it was quite challenging to hold the classical position of Muslims that apostasy will bring the killing, the punishment of killing, right? The examples are many. These were just two examples. So, the third example, the third point about the contemporary, approaching the contemporary was, say, because the history before or prior to modernity, in the long run, starting from when the Prophet Muhammad came, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, until the modernity started, in the wake of modernity, that long run history was quite similar in their form, in their substance, in their content, in their way, not much radical difference. Because of that, the to solve the questions, right, and to extract the meanings of the Sharia and to apply the Sharia was easy. We had a very easy, very simple tool and methodology which we call qiyas, right? Many of you might be and must be aware of the qiyas analogy. So analogy was quite sufficient, efficient, and widespread tool to apply Sharia in whatever comes new in the life. But when these developments took place, that time Muslims were not able to apply or to use this methodology, this tool, methodological tool, to apply Sharia, to understand Sharia, to connect their realities with the Sharia. So qiyas became quite challenging and insufficient or ineffective for them. So these were the three aspects of the contemporary or the modernity that compelled Muslim scholars to revisit their tradition, to revise their tradition, and to approach the contemporary differently. Now, briefly, what are the different ways in which our scholars, contemporary scholars, they try to approach the contemporary in a different way? Here, let me shed a little bit light on a very famous, very popular, and very common concept that we all must be aware of and interested in, and that is Maqasidu Sharia. I'm sure that in your course you must be getting some courses, some modules, and some lectures on Maqasidu Sharia. So Maqasidu Sharia, actually objectives of Sharia, intents of Sharia, right? The translation of Maqasidu Sharia is objectives and intents of Sharia. Maqasidu Sharia or intents of Sharia is not something new. It's something very old, as old as our tradition. But the way Maqasidu Sharia was expounded, developed, and consolidated in contemporary world is a recent phenomena, is something new. And the thing is, when at methodological level qiyas became ineffective, insufficient for questions, for issues to be dealt with, Maqasidu Sharia became a wonderful alternative for that. Because Maqasidu Sharia is something which doesn't deal with the specificities of the life or specificities of the Sharia, of the text. It deals more with the spirit of the Sharia. It remains adherent and ruled by the text, by the Sharia, but it focuses more, it emphasizes more on the what is beyond the text, what is between the lines of the text. And that methodology, when it needs time to talk more in Maqasidu Sharia, just in brief. So when Maqasidu Sharia emerged as a methodology, it helped scholars, our contemporary scholars, to carry out all the three different things which were the demand of the contemporary time. They became able to solve the questions, the new questions, the questions, for example, that we faced in politics. For example, the question of voting. For example, the question of voting, the question of participation in a democratic election. For example, the question of living as a minority in a majority non-Muslim country. For example, as we are living in India. For example, many Muslims are living in the West. For example. So these kind of questions, which are quite new and unprecedented for Islamic tradition, they became easy to answer through this methodology. So this was the first role that Maqasid played in dealing with the new questions. The second role it played in revising the classical tradition. So, for example, the division of the world into two, Darul Islam and Darul Kufr, people realized after using the Maqasid methodology that the whole notion of dividing the world into two is something product of a particular history, particular time, having nothing to do with the origin and with the original teaching of the Sharia, with the original text of the Sharia, for example. So they tried to use some new typologies and categories to understand the modern new division of the world and the countries. So apostasy also, for example. So many, or I'll say majority of the contemporary scholars, they agreed on the opposite view regarding apostasy. So they agreed that Islam doesn't carry any punishment for apostasy, for example. So this enabled them to revisit the Sharia in a more systematic way, uh, considering the diversity and complexity of the text, and at the same time considering the changed realities, the contemporary realities, the modern context. And finally, the third role it played was in providing a methodology beyond qiyas, which will help Muslim and scholars to be relevant, to remain relevant. Because Muslims, at one point of time, after the advent of modernity, they started feeling quite irrelevant about the modern world, right? So the scholars, those who played fundamental role in relevantizing Islamic tradition, they include among many Maududi, for example. So Maududi also played a key role in relevantizing the Islamic tradition, the Islam, for example, for the modern realities. So this was also one of the major role that Maqasid played. So this was something which I wanted to share with you about understanding of the Islamic intellectual tradition and how it evolved, how it developed, and what are its main features, and then what it means to approach the contemporary, why it requires us to have different methodology, different look, and different approach, and what are the different approaches. So I just mentioned one approach, which is Maqasid Sharia. There are multiple other approaches as well, which I hope, inshallah, you'll get opportunity during this long course. Again, let me thank our organizers and all of you, and let me congratulate all of you for this wonderful opportunity. May Allah bless us all and give us the tawfiq to utilize this opportunity in the best way, and help us to gain more and more knowledge and connect those knowledge with our realities, with our life, to make it ilmun nafi, beneficial knowledge. Jazakumullah khairan. Assalamu alaikum.